All right. Well, it is 5:05, so I am going to go ahead and officially start the Community Engagement Forum for this evening. First, I'd like to say thank you for joining us to learn about the West Court Street Safety Improvement projects that the city is proposing between Waveland Road and North Pearl Street. My name is Ahna Bizjak. I am a senior engineer with the city of Janesville, and I have been reviewing and studying the Court Street corridor over the last couple of years. And we're here tonight to present that information to you and talk about some things that we're looking to do related to the studies that we've been conducting. With me today is John Campbell. He is with the project consultant who works for Traffic Analysis and Design Incorporated, also called TADDY. And John is really, has also been studying this corridor for a couple of years and assisting the city in evaluating safety and traffic on this corridor. So with that, next slide, please, John. So we are meeting virtually given today's COVID-19 pandemic, and so we appreciate you joining us virtually. This is a GoToMeeting, and I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping and provide some technical information should you need it during the presentation. The presentation is being recorded this evening, so it will be posted to a website that we have developed. We'll have a link to that website later in the presentation. But this information will be available after tonight's meeting for people to view at any point over the next several weeks. If you have any technical issues, we do have an individual, Ingy Adams, who works for TADDY. She is on the meeting and is available to problem solve or troubleshoot any issues you might be having. Her email address and phone number are provided on the screen. I will read it for everyone. Adams, A-D-A-M-S, at taddy-us.com. That's TADI-us.com. And her phone number, 262-247-5421. So please feel free to contact her if you have any issues with the presentation. Few housekeeping, again, if people could mute themselves during the presentation, just so we don't hear background noise from your homes or wherever you're chiming in from. And if you do have a question, I would direct you to the chat box. You'll see there's a little text bubble up in the right-hand corner of your screen. If you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to add something into that chat box. We will hold questions until the end, but that's going to be the mechanism we will use to see what questions there might be for the project and be able to answer those. Lastly, you'll see there's a little gear shape to the right of that text bubble, and that really provides the camera and audio settings. So if you have issues, you can always check that as well to see if you're connected by phone or computer, that things are operating correctly. So that's really what we wanted to identify here. Moving on to tonight's agenda. So this presentation will be co-presented by both myself and John. I plan to cover the project goals as well as the results of the 2018 Safety and Traffic Study work that was done a couple of years ago. And then John is going to provide an in-depth look at the benefits of safety conversions and the traffic modeling efforts that have been done to date. And then I'll wrap up the presentation with a review of the federal aid safety applications that we've submitted, the project schedule, and lastly, how you can provide your feedback on this project over the next several weeks. Next slide, please. So there are 4 primary goals for this project. And it's the reason that we are here talking about safety improvement projects on West Court Street. We want to reduce crashes along the corridor and at intersections. We want to improve safety for bicyclists and pedestrians along the corridor. We want to maintain efficient operations along that corridor and the side roads that intersect it. And lastly, we want to improve compliance with the posted speed limit. So those are the 4 primary goals of our project. So we go a little background here. How did we get to this point, and why are we looking at this? And I will say it did all start in 2018 when the city hired TADI to perform what's called a safety screening analysis. Basically, they review crash data over a 5-year period of time at all local intersections in the city. And then that develops it ranks really the top 60 local intersections that have the highest economic loss due to crash frequency and crash severity. And so the map on the screen here shows red dots, which identify those top 60 intersections throughout the city. With this data, we are drilling down and looking closely at those intersections to identify opportunities to improve safety and look for ways for us to implement those safety improvement projects. And that's where we get to applying for federal aid. So there are safety grants and federal aid programs that are available to help pay for those safety improvement projects. You'll see here I've got highlighted, if we want to back up one more. I just want to identify what those circles are. The 4 blue circles on that screen are 4 locations where we've been successful in obtaining federal aid for safety improvement projects. And then that red oval identifies really what we're talking about tonight, the West Court Street corridor. Next slide. So if we look more closely at that West Court Street corridor, we see that 5 out of the 14 intersections are in the top 60 list. And by 14, I'm talking from Waveland all the way to Pearl Street. So for that length, there are 14 intersections, 5 of which are in the top 60 list. That's over 1/3 of the intersections on the corridor. I will point out that those include all 3 of the signalized intersections, with number 1, Court Street and Crosby Avenue being the number 1 highest intersection with the highest economic loss in the city for local intersections. And then number 3 is Court Street and Pearl Street. So when we look at that top 60 list, we're identifying some pretty significant intersections that we could see some safety improvements. But knowing that there were so many intersections that fell on that list, we really wanted to evaluate Court Street as a corridor and look at safety improvements that could be implemented along the entire corridor. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the 2018 traffic and safety study that we wanted to conduct. And the limits of that project really includes, it's a 1.3-mile corridor that goes from Waveland, the west side of the city, extended east to Pearl Street. And what we're looking at are the corridor as a whole, but we also looked very closely at 6 of the intersections and evaluated traffic operations for those 6 locations. And those 6 locations include the 5 that were in that top 60 screening list, and then the 1T intersection at Grant Avenue. Next slide. For the 2018 traffic and safety study, what were we looking at? So we're looking at 2 things. We're looking at safety and we're looking at traffic. So we want to first identify what crashes are we seeing on the corridor. We're going to identify some crash patterns, and then we're going to determine some safety improvement solutions. But we also want to evaluate operations on that corridor. So we want to evaluate the traffic. So we collected traffic data at the intersections to get turning movement data. We forecasted those volumes out for a 20-year design life up to 2043 because we know we're going to see additional traffic growth on that corridor. We want to plan for that. We also want to evaluate the operations with any modifications that we might be considering based on implementing safety improvements. What we don't want is we don't want our safety improvements to compromise traffic operations. We want to improve both of those things. And so that's why we're looking at both the safety component and a traffic component. Next slide, please. The results of the safety study really illustrate, unfortunately, that West Court Street has a lot of crashes. It has more than we would expect on this corridor. Over that 5-year period of time, there were 164 crashes along that corridor, and this is from the years 2014 to 2018. That includes 2 fatalities, 1 incapacitating injury, and then 20 injury crashes. Also of note, those crashes that we reviewed included 16 bicycle and pedestrian related crashes. And as we all know, a crash with a bicyclist or a pedestrian tends to result in higher injuries because we're talking about vulnerable users on the roadway. Overall, the corridor crash rate on West Court Street is more than double the statewide crash rate. On the right, it just shows an image. Oh, I'm sorry. On the right, it just shows an image of a collision diagram. So basically what TADI did as part of this analysis is they mapped out the locations of every crash along the corridor to identify trends and identify potential solutions for how we could reduce those crashes. And so that's what we're looking at from a safety perspective. Next slide, please. As far as the traffic safety or this traffic study results go, again, we looked at 4 scenarios. Those top 2 scenarios, the 2018 traffic with existing conditions and the 2043 traffic with existing conditions, we wanted to establish a baseline. We wanted to establish where are things today and what will happen in the future as we see additional traffic on the corridor. The last 2 scenarios are showing how we expect operations to work with some recommended improvements, meaning what modifications to the corridor are we looking at to address safety and to address traffic, and how will those operations change based or with those modifications in place. I will also note that we've modeled both the AM and PM peak hour, so the highest hours of travel on the corridor, 7:15 to 8:15 a.m. and 3:15 to 4:15 p.m. Next slide, please. So before we get into the results of that traffic study, I want to talk a little bit about how we measure operations at intersections. And it's based on delay, and it's called level of service. So the level of service really represents how well the intersection is functioning with that much traffic. It is measured as an A through an F, no different than when we were in grade school. If we were getting an A, we were doing great. And if we were getting an F, we were not doing so great. So it's very similar. I will point out there are 2 tables on the right, and that is because level of service is different based on whether you're at a signalized intersection or an unsignalized intersection. Drivers tend to accept more delay at a signalized intersection because they know at some point their light's going to turn green and they're going to get the opportunity to travel through. At an unsignalized intersection, it's dependent on a gap. And so for that level of service, it's a lower threshold for the amount of delay that is considered acceptable. In general, level of service D is considered acceptable operations. And the reason for that is that, again, we're modeling the highest hour of the day. And if we can get level of service D at the highest hour of the day, we're going to have great operations during those off-peak times. A few things to note quickly. Level of service D, just to give a frame of reference, for a signalized intersection is right around a minute. So up to 55 seconds. of delay is what's considered acceptable during that peak hour. At an unsignalized intersection, for example, that drops to 35 seconds of delay. So I just wanted to kind of point that out quickly. Next slide, please. So when we looked at the modeling of existing traffic, the 2018 traffic turning movement volumes that were collected, and the existing 4-lane cross-section, we modeled each of those 6 intersections, and those are listed on the table at the right. You may not be able to see the numbers real clearly, but what I'm trying to highlight here is where we know we've got some potential congestion or some potential issues. So existing today, what we're seeing is that really all movements operate at a level of service D or better, with the exception of the westbound movement on Court Street at the Crosby Avenue intersection during the peak PM hour. At that location, we're seeing level of service E with 58 seconds of average delay. That's just above our level of service D, so we're just starting to see that movement start to fail. Next slide, please. As we project to that 2043 traffic, so again, we're looking 20 years out, we've added traffic to the model to reflect what conditions will be like in 20 years. And what we see, probably no surprise to anyone, we see conditions get a little bit worse. Now the westbound Court Street movement at Crosby is a level of service F, circled up above, with 230 seconds of delay on average. That's just about 4 minutes. So that's kind of unacceptable. And we'll need to address that. We'll need to make some improvements to look at that. In addition, you'll see that that southbound movement on Oak Hill is also experiencing a level of service F. And that is an uncontrolled intersection, or not uncontrolled, excuse me, stop controlled on Oak Hill. It's unsignalized, I should say. And that is showing 61 seconds of average delay in this scenario. Next slide, please. So the next scenario we looked at is that 2043 traffic, but let's optimize operations on the corridor with that 4-lane typical section. We will see slight improvements. That's the goal here, is to get rid of some of those level of service F if we can and try to optimize those operations. The modifications that were modeled in this particular scenario really focus on the Crosby and Court Street intersection, because that's where we're seeing really that significant traffic congestion starting to occur. What you'll see is that what we did is we adjusted cycle lengths and signal phasing for optimal operations. We reconfigured the north and south left turn lanes on Crosby Ave to be aligned across from each other to improve visibility. And we looked at having those northbound and southbound left turn movements operate with a flashing yellow arrow, which is a permissive left turn movement. What that did is it cleared up the congestion on West Court Street, but we do see some delay for that Crosby Avenue approach, north and south, and we see no change at that Oak Hill Avenue intersection in this scenario. Next slide. The last scenario that we looked at is the safety conversion scenario. So the safety conversion is a 3-lane cross-section that consists of 2 through lanes and a center 2-way left turn lane. So we modeled the corridor on that 3-lane cross-section. In addition, we looked at some modifications that are focused on that Court Street and Crosby Avenue intersection, including the same ones as before. We adjusted cycle lengths, signal phasing, reconfigured those north and south left turn lanes to be aligned across from each other, having those left turns operate with a permissive left turn or a flashing yellow arrow movement. And then in addition, we looked at adding dedicated right turn lanes at the Crosby Ave, or on Court Street at the Crosby Ave intersection. What you'll see here is that this scenario really offers the best operations of all of the ones that we've looked at. So it's actually providing the best level of service at each of those 6 intersections that were evaluated for this study. Next slide, please. Based on the crash review analysis and the operational analysis, the results of the 2018 study included the following recommendations. It recommended for the city to consider a 3-lane, 2-way left turn lane cross-section on West Court Street, also called a safety conversion. The reason for that is that it shows that it has acceptable operations compared with the 4-lane, and I would argue even potentially better operations. And it also offers research-proven safety benefits, meaning we'll see the ability for us to reduce crashes on the corridor. The second recommendation was to consider specific improvements at the Crosby Avenue intersection, specifically looking at providing those dedicated left turn, through, and right turn lane in the eastbound and westbound directions, reconfiguring that northbound and southbound left turn lane to be aligned directly across from each other, installing new high visible traffic signals and vehicle detection, implementing that flashing yellow arrow, and adding pedestrian countdown timers and high visibility crosswalks. Next slide. And then the last recommendation was to also consider similar traffic signal improvements at Arch Street and Pearl Street, more specifically looking at installing new highly visible traffic signals, implementing that flashing yellow arrow operation for left turns, and looking at countdown pedestrian timers and high visibility crosswalk markings. At this time, I would like to turn the presentation over to John Campbell, who is going to go into more detail on the safety benefits of safety conversions, the reasons this is a good fit for West Court Street. He'll provide some examples of other successful conversions and share some traffic modeling simulation videos to illustrate how the corridor will operate with the safety conversion. So John, take it away.
Thank you, Anna. Very well said traffic operations analysis from one traffic engineer to another. I'm impressed. So reasons, what are some of the reasons we saw such a poor safety performance on Court Street? One of the reasons, and I'll go over several of them, is it has characteristics that are similar to a 4-lane undivided roadway, because that's what it is. 4-lane undivided roadways have lots of conflict points. Conflict points are locations where vehicles could potentially collide or collide with pedestrian or bicycle. On these type of corridors, we see lots of merging crashes, rear end crashes, right angle, left turn angle crashes. Those are very common crash types on 4-lane undivided. In the middle of the screen, a very common thing to occur on a 4-lane roadway like this is the possibility of a hidden vehicle effect, where a vehicle in the inner lane will actually block the vision of a vehicle approaching on the other lane. And not only is that dangerous for left turners, it's also dangerous for people on foot or bike crossing the street. I've seen people trying to cross a 4-lane undivided roadway where one vehicle stops for them, they wave them across, and then there's another vehicle coming around, and sometimes the ped or bike is struck when they're trying to cross. Studies have also shown that the risk of crashes decreases when vehicles are traveling the same speed. A 4-lane roadway really doesn't foster an environment for consistent vehicle speeds, with people stopping in the inner lane to make left turn lanes. Other vehicles are forced to swerve around them or slow down quickly. It creates a large differential for speeds on the corridor. And then lastly, there's many challenges for pedestrians and bicyclists. It's long crossing distances across 4 lanes of active travel. There's a lack of bicycle facilities on your typical 4-lane undivided roadway. And then there's, on Court Street specifically, there's a lack of some of the features we like to see to improve pedestrian safety. Countdown pedestrian timers, those are those walk, don't walk signs that actually show the countdown timer of how much time you have left to cross the street. and then things like high visibility crosswalks that really draw attention to pedestrians and bicyclists in the area. So what are some things we can do to improve safety? Number one, we want to reduce conflict points. When we're looking at a roadway project where we want to improve safety, we want to reduce the opportunities for vehicles to collide with one another. We also want to improve the visibility of approaching traffic. Throughout my career, I've looked at well over 10,000 crash reports, and I can assure you that nobody purposefully drives into another person or another vehicle. Very many times they turned and they just did not see the approaching vehicle, whether that was blocked, their vision was blocked by another vehicle in another lane, or if it was another site obstruction, a tree started encroaching near the intersection. People don't purposely drive into others. Another thing I've seen happen a lot is when you get into complex situations where drivers are trying to cross, let's say, 4 lanes of traffic, which is, it happens on a 4-lane undivided. It just becomes cognitively too difficult. There's just too much information for the human brain to process for some drivers, and they make decisions where they may not see the approaching vehicle because their brain's focused on the elements they can process. Another way we can improve safety is, enabling consistent vehicle speeds. That really reduces lane changing, the need to pass. It also helps people on side streets choose appropriate gaps because they can better estimate how long it'll take for an approaching vehicle to get there. And then pedestrian and bicycle safety. How do we improve safety? Well, that's all about exposure, vehicle speed, and visibility. We want to reduce the exposure to motor vehicles by shortening crossing distances. We want safe vehicle speeds. Every mile per hour matters when we're talking pedestrian and bicycle safety. There's some real big differences in the injury outcomes of pedestrians with just a few miles per hour slower vehicles. And then we want to just draw attention and visibility to pedestrians and bicyclists through better pavement marking, features like countdown timers, and strategically placed crossings for pedestrians potentially at mid-block locations. So how are these objectives accomplished? Those would be great things to do, but how do you do them? One way to accomplish them on a 4-lane undivided roadway is to consider a safety conversion. What is a safety conversion? Anna talked a little bit about this, but it's really the repurposing of a roadway that accomplishes these objectives of reducing conflict points, providing better visibility of approaching traffic, making vehicle speeds more consistent, and then really fosters an environment for improving pedestrian and bicycle accommodations. A safety conversion is really about optimizing the roadway space. You take a 4-lane cross section and you repurpose it and improve it, and you try to get more out of the roadway without having to widen the roadway. It involves converting the 4 automobile lanes on the roadway to 3 automobile lanes, one in each for a through lane in each direction, and then a center 2-way left turn lane, which harbors the left turn traffic. Also, because there's usually a little extra space then, it gives you the ability to put in bicycle lanes. It's commonly called a road diet in literature, but we believe a safety conversion is a much more appropriate name for them. They're also called a 3-lane, 2-way left turn lane, or a twiddle. Some features about a 3-lane twiddle or safety conversion is that it maintains business access, which is really important, and in many cases actually improves business access because it provides a dedicated left turn lane into driveways along the corridor. It usually has a very small impact on overall corridor travel time. That may seem counterintuitive. Hey, how are you going from 4 through lanes to 2 through lanes and still maintaining the same travel speeds and corridor time? And that has a lot to do with really 2 things. There's a lot of interruptions on a 4-lane roadway when people are slowing down to make left turn lanes. And oftentimes the capacity of a roadway is dictated more by the intersections along it, the signalized intersections along it, than actually the roadway itself. 3 lanes can also provide a safer environment for our most vulnerable users, specifically pedestrians and bicyclists. And I've heard this quite often by public officials and police officers, and we'll give you some resources on the social media website, the Social Pinpoint website, that direct you to some videos about 3 lanes. A lot of times when they're discussing whether or not they put this in, I've heard the remark, well, if it doesn't work, it's just pavement marking. We'll restripe it the way it was in the old, how it was before. So why do we think West Court Street's a good candidate for a safety conversion? So there's a couple of main reasons why we think it is. Number one, the traffic volumes. We forecasted traffic all the way out to 2043, and we expect those volumes to be well within the capacity of what a 3-lane cross-section can handle. They can handle volumes up to 26,000. And where Court Street is now and where it's projected to be is in a very favorable range for conversion to 3-lane cross sections. Number 2, intersection performance. Oftentimes, as I just mentioned, that the intersections tend to control the capacity of the roadway more than the number of lanes on the roadway. And you know, as Ahna explained, that we saw some really good performance at the intersections with the 3-lane cross section all the way out to 2043. Number 3, we think it's a good candidate just because of the number of pedestrian and bicycle crashes that have occurred. 16 head and bike crashes in a 5-year period, including 1 fatal pedestrian crash. It's really a staggering number, and it's also evident that vulnerable road users are using this roadway and corridor to not only access businesses, but where they live and where they function in their lives. So we think it vastly improve the conditions for peds and bikes. And number 4, this type of conversion based on the crash history that we saw out there, it makes it a real good candidate for federal funding, 90% federal funding through the HSIP program. So perhaps you didn't learn about a 3-lane twiddle or a road diet or a safety conversion in driver school. They were new to me at once too, but because they haven't always existed. One of the first known installations of a safety conversion was in 1979, and they didn't really start growing in popularity to the 1990s. But today in 2020, they're standard practice. They're located all over the country and throughout Wisconsin. And in 2012, the Federal Highway Administration identified road diets or safety conversions, as we like to call them, as a proven safety countermeasure. And then they were able to prove this through rigorous before and after benefit analysis, before and after studies. The Wisconsin DOT is an advocate for road safety conversions, and they've had many successful conversions throughout the state. They estimate on average a crash reduction of about 30% when these are installed on 4-lane roadways. Many of those sites are listed on this slide. The picture from Park Falls in the upper right is a real good example of some of the pedestrian improvements you can incorporate into a 3-lane cross section, where you don't have driveways and have some spacing in between them. You can do crossings for pedestrians and provide a safe median refuge for them. I wanted to show you an example of a very successful safety conversion in Oshkosh on Murdoch Avenue. This roadway has some of the same characteristics of Court Street and had similar daily volumes. I also wanted to show it as an example because it was met with a lot of resistance at first. The engineering staff had done a thorough review of the traffic and safety along this corridor and presented the safety conversion as an option, the preferred option to convert the roadway and make it more safe and efficient. And at first, it was voted down by the Common Council there. And it took a little back and forth before it was eventually installed. So I just wanted to highlight that sometimes these roadways can be met with, some initial opposition, but after they're installed, they tend to really operate smoothly. And we looked at the before and after crashes on Murdoch Avenue, and it was extremely successful at reducing crashes. Total crashes went down 72%. Injury crashes almost 80%. And on a corridor that had 7 head and bike crashes in 5 years before the install, it had 0 in the 4 years after. And that was just reconfiguring the roadway with a safety conversion. The curb and gutter wasn't changed. It was just painted differently to better optimize that roadway space. So to help illustrate how this corridor would look and operate after a safety conversion, we put together 3 simulations of kind of the worst case scenario looking out to 2043 in the PM peak hour. And I will just briefly show the simulations. The simulations are about 3 minutes each. I won't go through the complete simulation. They're available on the Social Pinpoint site, but I will just point out what the simulation shows and things you can look for in it. So the first one shows really the complete corridor, beginning on the far west end of the corridor at Waveland Road, what this cross-section could look like after a safety conversion. And it shows the simulated traffic from that PM peak hour out in 2043. I did want to note that, this is a conceptual representation. It's obviously subject to change in the design process, but we really wanted to, give you a vision of what this corridor could potentially look like after a safety conversion would be implemented. As we go along the corridor here, you'll see vehicles traveling in that through lane. What appears to be consistent vehicle speeds. As you get further along in the corridor, there'll be some interaction with vehicles turning out of driveways. Here's a motorist waiting and making a left turn out. We're approaching, the major intersection on this corridor, the traffic signal at Crosby Avenue. I'm just going to pause here for a second to highlight some of the features with high visibility crosswalks, improved lane utilization with exclusive right turn lanes, left turn lanes, and a through lane. And then there'll be improved signal visibility with overhead traffic signals. And you can see how that pedestrian stands out on that high visibility crosswalk, even on a simulation. There's a motorist that used that left turn lane to turn in. I'll skip ahead a little bit to get a little more interaction. Drivers making some movements in and out of the roadway here. There'll also be an updated traffic signal at Arch Street. Here's some more drivers exiting. Skip ahead. Here's Oak Hill Avenue, one of the busier side streets. Vehicle turning off of Court Street. Here's some people leaving the drive-through lane at Frosty Freeze and turning onto the corridor. The next simulation is specifically at Crosby Avenue. This is a major intersection on the corridor. I'll show this video just to show how this operates. Projected out to 2043. These northbound and southbound left turns are better aligned, providing better visibility of approaching traffic. There's a pedestrian crossing, east leg of the intersection. So this is a 3.5-minute video that's available on the Social Pinpoint site. Please view it, check it out. It shows how we anticipate this intersection will operate. Later in the video, there'll be some driveway interaction, vehicles getting in and out of these driveways.
You can also, if you watch the simulation, you'll see that queuing, so you can see kind of the extent to which we expect during that peak hour, how far that queue would extend in all of the quadrants. So that's another thing you can sort of visualize there is how that works and how those clear out with the signal operations.
And lastly, the third simulation is more from the driver's perspective of trying to pick and choose gaps to turn onto or across Court Street. This is a concern that gets brought up a lot in 4-lane to 3-lane conversion projects. Will there be enough gaps for the side street drivers to safely get on the street? And Oak Hill Avenue being one of the busiest intersections that isn't signalized is a real good example to show of there being available gaps, actually ample gaps, to get vehicles in and off of that roadway safely. This video is kind of broken in 2 parts. It shows the perspective looking to the west for the first half of the video, and then we flip over and we'll be looking to the east on the second part of the video. But this should help you kind of visualize more at the street level what this corridor could potentially look like. Here's some left turners looking to turn onto Oak Hill Avenue. They're going to safely maneuver into that 2-way left turn lane, and then they're just going to wait until they have a gap to complete their maneuver. And then I'll just show a little bit on the screen here, the other vantage point looking to the east. Ahna, is there anything else you wanted to add about the simulations?
No, the real intent for doing this level of analysis is to ensure that this cross-section does not diminish the operations on the corridor. So that's really what we wanted to identify and determine, is that will there still be adequate gaps to allow people to turn onto the corridor on the side roads? And will there be adequate operations at those signalized intersections for the Court Street traffic as well as those side roads? So I hope that people take the time to take a look at those, and I hope that they find them helpful.
Thank you. All right, so we were able to do the traffic simulations of this roadway out to 2043, and that gave us the opportunity to look at, hey, what is the travel time from the far west side of the corridor to the far east side of the corridor? You know, is that 3-lane cross section going to slow up travel from one end to the other? Research and previous examples have showed that it shouldn't. It might on a very high volume corridor when you start getting in the $20,000–$25,000 vehicles per day, but on a corridor like Court Street, that's more in the, you know, that 10 to 13,000 range of volumes per day. We anticipated results that would show that travel time did not change much, and that's what the results showed. We ran 10 simulations, and it had a minimal impact on corridor travel time. It was 227 seconds to traverse the corridor on average, using the safety conversion cross section, and 211 using the 4-lane cross section. I think that's, you know, a 16-second difference. So the difference is in seconds, not minutes. And then as far as speed, we just took a look at what that average speed to get from point A to point B across the whole corridor was, and we saw a slight reduction in travel speeds, which is good for pedestrian and bicycle safety throughout a corridor. Every mile per hour matters. And then lastly, I just wanted to speak on, you know, crash reductions and what the real impact of those are. You know, we said crash reductions of potentially 30% or a range, you know, up to 47%. In Oshkosh, they saw 78% crash reduction of injury crashes. You know, that's fine to mention, just throw out those percentages, but I really want you to help visualize what even achieving a 30% crash reduction on Court Street would do. Over the next 10 years, a 30% crash reduction would be 100 fewer crashes on that Court Street corridor, which would result in 100 fewer police responses, because most crashes have 2 vehicles in urban situations like that. That's 200 vehicles that would not be damaged. And since the average occupancy of vehicles is about 1.5 people, that's nearly 300 vehicle occupants. That's people in your community or visiting your community that won't be involved in a car crash over the next decade. So when we set and achieve goals of crash reduction, there are some real impacts to roadways and communities. And that concludes my information about safety conversions and what some of those safety impacts can be. So, Anna, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, John. So based on this analysis and the work that we've been looking at, a resolution was passed in August that authorized staff to proceed with submitting 2 Highway Safety Improvement Program applications. This is a federal aid program that does allow for funding to be available for projects that qualify for documenting or a documented safety improvement, meaning you have to demonstrate that the improvements that you're recommending are going to have a real impact, like John described, for reducing crashes and improving safety. So 2 applications were submitted, the first of which focuses on those intersection improvements, and I'll get into that in a little more detail. The second application is specific to the corridor and is based on that 3-lane twiddle cross-section, or what we've been calling that safety conversion. Those applications were submitted in August, and next slide, please. What we are showing here really is specific to the signal intersection application that was submitted. It focuses on the 3 signalized intersections, and it focuses on the improvements that John and I have been talking about, enhancing the visibility of the traffic signal, improving the operations at those signals, enhancing the pedestrian accommodations. We're talking about things like overhead traffic signals, a signal head per lane, retroreflective backplates. You'll see in these images, there's this orange rectangle around the signal. It just provides more visibility of the signal head itself. The pedestrian countdown timers we've been talking about, the high visibility crosswalks. All of those improvements are identified in this application for the 3 signalized intersection, Crosby, Arch, and Pearl Street. Next slide. The second application, as I mentioned, is really specific to implementing a safety conversion along the corridor, extending from Waveland Road to Pearl Street. The cross-section or the project itself would include a mill of the existing asphalt and an overlay of new asphalt, which would allow for new pavement markings to go down, which would identify the 2 through lanes, a center 2-way left turn lane. And in this case, we would have additional width on the street to accommodate on-street bike lanes. This will enhance accommodations for bicyclists by providing their own space to operate along this corridor without conflicting with vehicular traffic or with pedestrians on the sidewalk. So our application does include the addition of on-street bike lanes. We would also be looking at some mid-block pedestrian crossings, some high volume locations where pedestrians want to cross the street, where they may not be close to a signalized intersection, where they can have a controlled location to cross. So we'd be looking at potentially 3 locations for some mid-block crosswalks. And then we would also look to replace all of the non-compliant accessible ramps along the corridor. Next slide, please. So an overview of those projects and the funding that is required for them. On the left, I have a breakdown of the costs associated with the signalized intersection application. That one has a project estimate, including design, real estate, and construction, for a total cost of about $1.8 million. The breakdown of that for federal share would be 90%, or $1.58 million, and the local share $230,000. On the right, we have the corridor safety conversion application. You'll see that the total project estimate for design, real estate, and construction for that project is $2.2 million. The federal share just under 1.9, and the local share $324,000. So in total, we are looking at a $4 million value in investments or improvements along this corridor, with $3.45 million in federal dollars and a $554,000 local investment. One thing I want to mention is that related to that real estate, I just want to mention the intent with this project is not to move the curb and gutter along the corridor, but we do anticipate the potential need for right-of-way where we would be widening to add right turn lanes at Crosby Ave, or where we need to make modifications to the accessible ramps at the intersections located along the corridor. Next slide, please. So an overview of our schedule. Right now, what we're looking at is we expect to get a formal determination from DOT in December. We do feel very optimistic that our projects will be approved, but we've not yet received the formal approval that should be coming yet this year. Should we get approval, the plan going forward would be to enter into an agreement with DOT and start the consultant selection process in 2021. We anticipate beginning design in 2022. We would look to start the right-of-way acquisition in 2023, and then we would implement the improvements in 2025. Next slide, please. Well, you've heard a lot of information from us. We want to hear from you. So the city welcomes your input on these proposed projects. And in this virtual environment, we know that we need to find new ways for people to get involved and provide that feedback. So we have developed a social pinpoint project website that John has been referencing a few times throughout the presentation to give you additional information, additional resources, and the opportunity to engage and provide your thoughts, comments, and feedback. John, if you wouldn't mind just clicking on that link, this will bring you to the landing page, the home page of the social pinpoint site. There's a lot of information if we scroll down, but one of the things I really want to highlight is the interactive map, so I can help show how we might provide feedback. So if you scroll down, John, and click on that Get Started for the Provide Your Feedback place, what that's going to do, it's going to bring up a map of the corridor with some information and a legend on the left. If you close that legend out, you can get rid of that so you can see the whole map. But if you click on the boundary, click on that dashed boundary, that should bring up a window that's going to describe the safety conversion project and give an image. You can start a discussion. So if you click on that text bubble, it brings up a window where you can provide your feedback or your thoughts on that. In addition, if you want to close out of that, John, along the top of the map, you'll see there are some icons. And they say things like make a comment, something I like, an idea or suggestion, ask a question, something I don't like. You can drag one of those icons down onto the map. And when you do that, it will bring up a similar window. You can provide your comment and hit add comment. And that's how we're going to be collecting people's feedback on this project. If you go back and to the return button, John, on the far left. Yeah, that one right there. That's just going to bring us back to that home page. If you'd scroll down just a minute, I just want to click on, so we've got 2 additional pages with information. The traffic signal safety improvements is on the left. If you click learn more, that's going to bring up another page with specific information related to the traffic signal project. On the right, there's some drop-down information, so you can click on one of those arrows. It will bring up additional information specific to that particular intersection. So we invite you to explore the website. There's a ton of information there. If you are not comfortable using the website, certainly we will accept comments through calling in, providing written comment, or emails as well. So if you could go back to the presentation and we'll just bring up our contact information. I see we're at 6:02 and I indicated our meeting would go till 6, so we're running a few minutes late here. But here is contact information for both John and I. If you have any questions or have any information you want to share with us, please feel free to do so. And with that, I would open it up to some questions because we don't have a large group here. So if people have a specific question that they'd like to ask, now would be an opportunity for you to do that.
I would like to ask a question.
Hello.
Hello? I would like to ask
Yes.
a question.
Of course.
Since this is going to run from 2021 through early 2026, will all of the traffic patterns from, say, Milwaukee on the other side of the courthouse and down through downtown Janesville and out across, you know, and coming towards the Court Street, heading out to perhaps Footville, is that all going to be connected and all patterned together over that, say, 4 or 5 years, or is that going to be jerry-rigged?
Well, is your question related to other construction projects that are happening in the city and how they relate to the Court Street, to this project?
I guess if we're gonna, and I'm incredibly impressed with the ton of work that you guys have put in, and I thank you very much. It's just that if somebody retires or somebody goes away and this all changes, is this all been set up so that the work that saves lives on Court Street, which I'm deeply grateful for, will continue. There won't. It will all stay the same. The original architecture of that particular section.
Yeah,
will
that's a great question. That's a great question, because you're right. We are talking about implementation in 5 years for that actual construction project to occur. The answer to that really is that if we are successful in obtaining the federal aid through the HSIP program, the Highway Safety Improvement Program, the city would be committed to following what was identified in that safety improvement application. And so the DOT would say, City of Janesville, we will support your project with these federal dollars. They met the criteria for reducing crashes, and they show that they're going to be a successful project. But you only get that money if you hold what you included in your application. So yes, there is going to be a requirement for the city to follow through with what was submitted in their application.
Okay. Other than that, I thank all of you.
Well, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
I have a quick technical question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
John was talking about projected improvements from a 30% crash reduction, 100 fewer crashes. Over what period of time are we talking there?
I was talking about a 10-year period.
Over 10 years. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's all I needed. Thank you.
Well, can I interject here? John, does that include not getting run over by someone as you try to drive across the street from Oak Hill to the other side of the street?
It might help with that situation.
Okay.
I try to reduce crash risk. I can't guarantee a specific crash that I can prevent, but we can try to reduce the risk.
Well, if there are no other questions, I really want to thank everyone for taking time out of your evening to join us. As I mentioned, this information is being recorded. It will be posted to that same Social Pinpoint site. We welcome your feedback, your input, and your comments, and please feel free to share this with others. We want to hear from the city, and this is the opportunity. We will be accepting comments through Friday, December 11th. So there is a good period of time that spans both before and after the upcoming holiday, and we hope to get some really good input. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope everyone has a healthy and wonderful evening.
You as well.
You too.
Thank you.